The story was first told by Reserve Captain and Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross recipient Gerhard Bolt in his book published in 1947, Hitler, The Last 10 Days. And although God knows there are more important episodes from that time, I still consider this one so remarkable that I want to tell it to you. The story took place in the Führer bunker in March 1945, just 2 months before the Germans' surrender. The main roles in it are Adolf Hitler and General of the Armored Troops Dietrich Friedrich Wilhelm Eduard Casimir von Saucken. But before I go into the details of the legendary encounter between these two personalities, where the biography of the first is sufficiently well known, I would like to introduce you to Dietrich von Saucken, who came from Old Prussian nobility. He was born on May 16, 1892, in Fischhausen, East Prussia, which had about 2,880 inhabitants and was located on a bay on the northern coast of the Vistula Lagoon, and after graduating from the Royal Fridericianum College, which had already been founded in 1698 as a modern language school, he actually wanted to become a visual artist. In other words, he wanted to be a painter. But at his father's request, in 1910, he joined the prestigious Grenadier Regiment King Friedrich Wilhelm, 2nd East Prussian No. 3, stationed in Königsberg, with which Lieutenant von Saucken also went into World War I. At first, he was deployed on the Eastern Front, then in the West as a first lieutenant and company commander, and finally in 1918 as adjutant of the Königsberg 2nd Infantry Cyclist Brigade. From 1914 to 1918, he was wounded 7 times and decorated, among other honors, with both Iron Crosses, the Wounded Badge in gold, and the Knight's Cross of the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern with swords. In the First World War, von Saucken distinguished himself as an exceptionally daring and courageous officer, highly respected by his soldiers, and perhaps also somewhat smiled at because of his lifelong habit from bygone and forgotten times, the monocle and the cavalry saber, which he, as a tradition-conscious officer, would strap on for official occasions. After the war, in 1919, he voluntarily joined the Eastern Border Guard against expansionist Poland. Then, starting in October, he served as a company commander in the Provisional Reichswehr in the 1st Prussian Infantry Regiment, stationed in East Prussia, before transferring to the cavalry in December 1921 to the 8th Prussian Cavalry Regiment in Oels, Lower Silesia. From January 1923, he served in Osterode in East Prussia with the 2nd Prussian Cavalry Regiment. On July 27, 1923, he married his third cousin, 20-year-old Elisabeth Wilhelmina Elfriede Salome Sophie von Saucken, with whom he had 6 children. Their eldest son, Hans Erich Wilhelm Bartosz Siegfried von Saucken, fell on May 30th, 1944, one day after his 20th birthday, as a lieutenant in the 24th Panzer Regiment near Stanca in Romania, and rests at the War Cemetery in Iași. In April 1925, von Saucken was promoted to Rittmeister as the commander of the 2nd Squadron in the 2nd Prussian Cavalry Regiment in Lig, East Prussia. Later, his squadron was transferred to Osterode. In the mid and late 1920s, during the period of cooperation between the Reichswehr and the Red Army, Saucken was repeatedly granted leave to go to the Soviet Union to learn the Russian language. He completed this as a major on February 19th, 1935, by passing the interpreter's exam in Russian at the War School in Hanover, where he was employed as a tactics instructor. Promoted to colonel on June 1, 1939, he took part in the Polish and Western campaigns as commander of the cavalry regiment Zweital, and once again his motto applied: "Wherever I am, I'm always at the front." On November 16, 1940, he took command of the 4th Rifle Brigade, which had been formed on November 1, 1939. With this unit, starting on June 22, 1941, he participated in Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. On July 15th, an artillery bombardment of his command post killed part of his staff and seriously wounded him in the leg. However, he continued to command the battle for several hours during his treatment until he was relieved. From December 1941, having recovered his health to some extent, he took command of the 4th Panzer Division and led it into the Battle of Moscow. On January 1, 1942, he was promoted to Major General, and on the 6th. On February 6, 1942, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for the successful defensive battles around the city of Bolshov. But in the process, he was so badly wounded in the head and face that it wasn't until August 22, 1942, that he was fit for duty again, allowing him to take over the leadership of the School for Rapid Troops, namely Panzer Troop School II in Krampnitz. On that day, he was also awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. At the end of May 1943, after being promoted to Lieutenant General on April 1, 1943, von Saucken once again took command of his proven 4th Panzer Division, which he led in the tank battle at Kursk in July. Then, after a defensive success by his division, he was mentioned by name for the first time in the Wehrmacht report on December 3, 1943. In the 10 relentless defensive battles of the past days, the main Franconian 4th Panzer Division, under Lieutenant General von Saucken, and the Bavarian 296th Infantry Division, under Lieutenant General Kulmer, thwarted all Soviet breakthrough attempts under the most difficult combat conditions. On January 31, 1944, Saucken was awarded the Swords to the Knight's Cross, and on July 5th, after the battles northwest of Kiev against a Soviet force up to 10 times larger, he was mentioned again in the Wehrmacht report. Here, a tank battle group under the command of Lieutenant General von Saucken, using mobile tactics, destroyed 233 enemy tanks between June 27th and July 3rd. After his promotion to General of the Armored Troops on August 1, 1944, he then led, as commanding general, the 39th Reich Panzer Corps, which had emerged from his battle group until mid-October. After a short time in the Führer Reserve, he was recalled in December to form the Panzer Corps Grossdeutschland, which consisted of the Panzer Grenadier Divisions Brandenburg and Grossdeutschland. But when, in the middle of the formation, on January 12, 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder operation began with 3 to 4 times superior numbers, Saucken managed to lead his units in a somewhat orderly fashion as far as the Görlitz area. Here, however, a dispute about the senselessness of continuing the war with Colonel General Heinz Guderian, who had been appointed Chief of the Army General Staff, led to Saucken being transferred once again to the Führer Reserve. Around March 10, 1945, he received the order to report to the Führer bunker, to be informed there about the details of taking over the Second Army, although the sources give different dates for this. But when General of the Armored Troops von Saucken stood before Hitler in the conference room, the slim and elegant officer did not greet Hitler with the German salute, but with a military salute, that is, with his right hand on the visor of his cap, bowing slightly with his left hand on the saber strapped to his side. And in his left eye was the monocle, as the single eyeglass was called in the past. But with that, von Saucken had violated what had been made obligatory for reports at the Führer headquarters since the assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944. Instead of the military salute, the so-called German salute, and out of fear of assassination attempts, reports were always to be made without bringing a weapon. But von Saucken wasn't finished yet, because while the facial expressions of those present, including Guderian and also the head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party Chancellery, Martin Bormann, were slipping, Hitler generously overlooked von Saucken's behavior and instead instructed Guderian to brief the monocle-wearing general about the situation in East Prussia and the combat area around Danzig. After that, he gave von Saucken the order to proceed immediately to East Prussia and take command of the Second Army there. He had added to the order that von Saucken could only command his own units there, while in all other matters, the Gauleiter of Danzig would have the final say. In this case, that was SS Obergruppenführer Albert Forster, who had been appointed Gauleiter there since 1930. Since the beginning of the war, in 1939, like all other Gauleiters, he had been appointed Reich Defense Commissioner, and since September 25, 1944, he was also the leader of the local Volkssturm. Here is his swearing-in at the end of November. But now, to subordinate himself to a military party dilettante was unacceptable for the highly decorated Saucken. With a sparkling monocle, looking Hitler straight in the face, and to support his view, striking the map table with his open hand, he had literally replied to Hitler's request, "I have no intention, Hitler, of submitting myself to the orders of a Gauleiter." Suddenly, according to Bolt, there was dead silence in the conference room. Quote, "You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet." And he goes on to say that before the general's words, Hitler apparently recoiled physically, his face looking even more waxen and his body more hunched than ever before. But when Guderian and Bormann then unsuccessfully tried to persuade Saucken to give in, to the surprise of those present, Hitler turned to the general and said in a weak voice, "All right, Saucken, then you keep the command yourself." Shortly afterwards, the general left the room with a slight bow to Hitler, without Hitler shaking his hand again. Saucken then flew to the Second Army, which was in a hopeless situation. Under his command, they were actually able to hold back the Red Army longer than expected, but eventually the army was split into two parts. As a result, the fate of the soldiers and civilians crowded together in the so-called cliff formation at the Bay of Danzig, known as Ochshöfter Kämpe, became increasingly uncertain. However, while according to a Führer order, this section of the Baltic Sea was to be held at all costs, von Saucken ordered the evacuation operation Waldpurgisnacht during the night of April 4th to 5th, 1945. As a result, the 9th Naval Security Division and frigate captain Adalbert von Blancs were able to bring around 30,000 refugees, 10,000 soldiers, some of them wounded, and remnants of the 8th Panzer Corps to the 34-kilometer-long Hell Peninsula in front of the Bay of Danzig. After that, the increasingly fierce Soviet attacks destroyed large parts of von Saucken's Second Army, but his units northwest of Danzig on the Ochshöfter Kämpe on Hell and those stationed in the Danzig lowlands continued to offer resistance until April 9th, 1945. For this, General of the Armored Troops von Saucken was awarded the diamonds to the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords on May 8th as the 27th and last soldier of the Wehrmacht to receive this honor. One day later, on May 9th, he was mentioned once again in the last Wehrmacht report. The Commander-in-Chief, General of the Armored Troops von Saucken, was awarded the diamonds to the oak leaves with swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in recognition of the exemplary conduct of his soldiers. Before I move on to the further fate of von Saucken, I would like to briefly go back to the moments when the general not only addressed the so-called Führer as Mr. Hitler, but also refused to subordinate himself to Gauleiter Forster. Because if you believe the account of SS Obersturmbannführer Heinz Linge, who served as Hitler's valet from January 1935 to April 30th, 1945, that never happened at all. At least, that's what it says in the book he published in 1980, together with Professor Dr. Werner Maser. It is undisputed that Slinge was almost always near Hitler and felt responsible for him, and that this loyalty was maintained even after Hitler's suicide. Therefore, his statement is understandable, especially since it was apparently supported by Professor Maser, who stood behind the book and considered himself the most competent of all so-called Hitler specialists. Regardless of that, I still maintain my view that the events happened exactly as Bolt described them. You only have to take a look at the last weeks of the Second World War to see that. On one side, there was the vegetarian Adolf Hitler, who had been under constant stress for years, with unhealthy sleeping and eating habits. After the assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944, he was physically weakened, marked by his Parkinson's disease, and repeatedly supplied with drugs by his strange personal physician, Dr. Morell. And then there was Dietrich von Saucken, who stood in the tradition of Prussian officers and appeared outwardly old-fashioned. You can learn a lot about his character traits in the book by Heinz Schäufler, the book about the 35th Tank Regiment. Saucken always led from the front, was a role model in commitment, attitude, and bravery, wore the Golden Wound badge, feared no danger, and had the complete trust of his soldiers. And when in May 1945, quite a few National Socialist politicians and even high-ranking officers said their goodbyes to their subordinates, so to speak, in French, some even in civilian clothes and with false papers. And when Grand Admiral Dönitz, who was the last German head of state in Flensburg, had sent him a plane, General von Saucken refused to flee with the words, "My place is with my soldiers." Instead, on his orders, the seaplane flew to Flensburg with wounded soldiers. Whoever behaves so responsibly in such dramatic life situations also greets Hitler in a military manner, with a saber strapped on, a monocle in his eye, and addresses him in the city with "My Führer," or Mr. Hitler. And he, in turn, was by then in such poor health that he probably didn't care much about how he was addressed, especially since he was well aware of his fate at the end of the Lost World War. What was he supposed to do with the well-deserved scoundrel anyway? Put him before a court-martial? After the surrender, he was taken prisoner, along with about 140,000 other soldiers of his army. He was initially held in solitary confinement in the notorious Moscow Lubyanka building, which until 1991 was the headquarters and central prison of the Soviet Secret Service. Then he was moved about 350 kilometers southwest of Moscow to the central prison of Oryol, where he was repeatedly tortured so severely that he later ended up in a wheelchair. In 1949, he was cared for in the camp, designated for German generals who were prisoners of war, Camp 5, 1100, 10, 48, Voykovo. This camp was located 300 kilometers northeast of Moscow, where the well-fed generals of the so-called National Committee for a Free Germany were also held, and tried to convert the other generals to communism. It was not until 1955, after 10 years of captivity, that the physically severely scarred general returned to Germany on the last transport. He then settled in Bavaria, and in 1968 published the history of his 4th Panzer Division, in order, as he said, to help keep alive the memory of the loyalty of the fallen. General of the Armored Troops A.D. von Saucken, probably the only German officer who addressed the so-called Führer as Mr. Hitler, passed away on September 27, 1980, at the age of 88 in Pullach, Bavaria.